Hey guys, welcome to the last lecture of this unit. So we're going to finish off this unit with proteins and amino acids. So first we'll do a little review from last week from our lipid lecture. So if you want to pause the video and go ahead and answer these questions, give some examples and names, and then we'll go through them together. All right, so what are some examples of simple lipids and complex lipids? So pretty much the glycerides, mono, di, and triglycerides are our simple lipids. So these are going to be what make up our fats and oils and even wax. So we talked a little bit about wax, and obviously it's not edible, but it is considered a simple lipid. But the oils and fats are really what we're concerned about in terms of diet and nutrition, right? So we talked a lot about those different triglycerides. And then some of our complex lipids are going to be the phospholipids that we said were really important for the cell membrane, right? So that's what makes up our cell membrane. Along with some glycolipids for cell signaling, membrane stabilization. And then lipoproteins we said were really important for carrying lipids around in the bloodstream. So it's a transport function for lipids, right? So it carries our cholesterol and our triglycerides around the body, and we talked about some of those lipoproteins being high density, low density, good versus bad in terms of our cholesterol. Okay, so lipoproteins are very important for lipid transport in the bloodstream. Now, what are those essential fatty acids we talked about? So we said that there are some fatty acids that we need to eat, and that makes them essential. We can't produce them in our body. So we have two that are considered absolutely essential for all species, and then we did have another one that we talked about for some species that can't convert the linoleic acid to arachidonic acid. So both of these are considered polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, okay? And one is an omega-3 fatty acid, that's linolenic, and one is an omega-6 fatty acid, and that's linoleic acid. So these two are our main essential fatty acids that we need to get in our diet because we can't produce them. And in some cases, that arachidonic acid as well fits in the essential fatty acid category. Okay. Now, we talked a bit about lipid absorption, and I don't want you to get too caught up in the details about lipid absorption. We kind of have to break down the fat and we put it back together in the cell. But the biggest thing about lipid absorption is that it's too big, usually, to be absorbed into our little tiny capillaries in the digestive system. So we're unable to actually absorb most of them into our bloodstream right away. So where do they go? They go into the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system, the capillaries in the lymphatic system are much larger in terms of being able to carry these large lipids. So they have to go through that lymphatic system in order to get into the cardiovascular system, into the bloodstream, because the lymphatic system, all roads of the lymphatic system drain to the heart. They all go to the heart. So it will eventually get to the bloodstream. But this is very different from especially carbohydrate absorption and metabolism and protein metabolism that we'll talk about today, okay? Because both of those go straight into the bloodstream and have to go through the liver for processing, okay? So just a little bit of a difference with lipid absorption and very important, okay? So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to talk about proteins, and proteins are made up of amino acids. So we'll talk a little bit about proteins and amino acids kind of together and separately. And then we'll talk about the functions of protein and amino acids in our body. Talk about protein metabolism, right? How we break proteins down, and nitrogen balance and why nitrogen is so important. And really, that protein is a source of nitrogen for us, okay? We'll talk a bit about protein quality, which is a big topic in nutrition because not all proteins are created equal, essentially, in terms of digestibility and what we can get out of them, okay? And that kind of has to do with what amino acids they make that make up the proteins. And we'll talk about protein requirements, right? What do we actually need as a requirement nutritionally for our bodies, and what happens if we don't get that protein, so protein deficiencies. So I have some pictures of eggs. They're the best natural source of protein, and a list of all those amino acids that make up our proteins. So what are proteins, right? So they're very complex molecules. They're large molecules, and they consist of a sequence of amino acids. So the amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So when we string all of these amino acids together, we actually fold them into a larger molecule and into a protein. And the highest concentration of protein is in animal muscle tissue. So that makes sense, right? So animals that eat high protein diets, you're mostly going to be eating animal tissue, and that will be most likely muscle tissue because that is where the protein lives, okay? So what are the functions of proteins, right? Especially in a dietary nutritional sense, right? Because proteins are obviously required by all of our cells for life, right? We require protein, and it's very important. And so when we talk about dietary protein, they're required for two different reasons. And the first is to gain access to those essential amino acids. And so essential, again, means we cannot make these amino acids in our body. We must consume them. So that's what essential means, just like we talked about our essential fatty acids. They are also a source of nitrogen. Okay, so nitrogen is a very important element that all living things require. Okay, so I just have, you don't need to know the nitrogen cycle, but I have just kind of a simplified diagram here of the nitrogen cycle in terms of, you know, even animals, plants, fungi, a lot of these things require nitrogen and aid in the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about nitrogen and how amino acids provide the nitrogen for us. Okay, and again, those are our list of essential amino acids. So we have quite a few essential amino acids. There's 20 amino acids, so 10, about half of those are essential amino acids, okay? So quite a few, unlike our essential fatty acids, which we only have 2, right? So quite a few more essential amino acids. So proteins are a very large group of complex molecules. So what are some of these broad categories of proteins that we find in our body? So don't get too caught up on the details because there are so many proteins out there, but we'll talk about some of them. So there are globular proteins. And so these guys make up a lot of our blood, okay? So albumin and globulins are found in our plasma of our blood, okay? So we have a couple different types, right? Albumin, globulins, fibrinogen. There are others, okay? But these guys are really important for the immune system, for blood clotting. Albumin is really the major component of osmotic pressure, meaning keeping our blood in our vessels, okay, instead of leaking out of the vessels. So albumin is a very large protein, and that's really a major part of it. Most of our protein in our blood is albumin, okay? So these guys are very important. They're all made in the liver, okay? So they're globular, and it's having to do with kind of the structure of the protein, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. We also have fibrous proteins. So these guys kind of think structural, okay? So collagens. So collagen is very important in our soft tissues. So collagen fibers are very strong. It's what makes up the majority of bone, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, skin, all of that is very important, all those connective tissues in our body, as well as keratin. So keratins like our hair, fingernails, things like that are all fibrous proteins. So collagen is very important structurally in our body as well, okay? And then we've already talked about a few of these conjugated proteins, and conjugated just means that it's with something else, so something other than a protein. So we just talked about lipoproteins, right? So they're part lipid, part protein, and they are functioning to carry lipids around the body. Okay, they're those spherical structures that help protect and carry all of the cholesterol and triglycerides throughout our blood. And then glycoproteins we talked a bit about in terms of our cell membranes as well. Okay, so they're part of the cell membrane structure and very important. So they're both proteins. One's just with a fat and one's with sugar, right? Glyco. Okay, so they're conjugated. Okay. So now let's look a little closer at amino acids and what they are and what the difference is maybe between essential versus non-essential amino acids. So like I said, we have 20 amino acids and about half of those are essential. Now there is a general structure to amino acids. So all of them have a carboxyl group and an amino group and a hydrogen. And then the only variation between them is considered this R group. So one of the structural pieces is a variant among all the different amino acids, and that's what make them different, okay? So they have a general structure, and then they just change that R group depending on which amino acid it is. So just to kind of get an idea, right, kind of a simplified look at an amino acid versus a protein and how we utilize those amino acids as building blocks. So we string together amino acids into what we call a peptide. So a peptide is just a string of amino acids, and then we fold those peptides, those amino acids, into a protein. And so the folding process and how the protein is folded is what gives it its different function in the body. So folding of the protein is very important in terms of what it's actually going to do in the body, what type of protein it is, but the building blocks are all the same for all proteins, and those are those amino acids. So let's look at essential versus non-essential amino acids. So essential means they're indispensable. So that means we require them in the diet. We cannot produce them from either other amino acids or other things in the body. So we require them in the diet. Now, some can be what's called conditionally essential, and we'll talk about that. That means maybe if you have a specific other amino acid, you could utilize that. So we'll talk about, that's why I kind of say about 10, approximately 10 essential amino acids, because some can be conditionally essential. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the other 10 are going to be non-essential, meaning they are dispensable and we can synthesize them from other amino acids. So we don't absolutely have to have them in our diet, okay? So that's the difference between essential and non-essential. So here are some terminologies that we use when we're talking about amino acids, and especially when we're talking about them in our diet. So when we spare an essential amino acid, the sparing of an essential acid means that we add some non-essential amino acids in the diet to reduce that requirement of the parent essential amino acid. So we said non-essential we can make from essential amino acids, but if we don't have to make them, right, if we don't have to make them and we just add them into the diet, that spares that parent essential amino acid. We don't require as much of that parent essential amino acid. So you don't have to memorize, what spares what, but this is just kind of an example. So the ones on the right-hand side are the essential amino acids that are being spared by the addition of those non-essential amino acids on the left-hand side in a diet. So just for example, you can add tyrosine into the diet and then you don't need as much phenylalanine. Okay, so the phenylalanine is the essential amino acid that can produce tyrosine. So usually we would take that phenylalanine and make tyrosine out of it. But if you just add it into the diet, you don't need as much phenylalanine because you don't need to make more tyrosine, if that makes sense. Okay, so it's just called sparing of the essential amino acids. Okay. So another term is a limiting amino acid. And this is the amino acid that is the most deficient in a protein. That means it has the lowest amount of that amino acid relative to the animal's requirement. So it may need more of that one amino acid as a requirement, but that protein doesn't have enough of it. Okay, so that would be the limiting amino acid in that protein. Because amino acid composition is very important when we're talking about proteins and protein quality, right? We said not all protein is created equal, and that has to do with the amino acid composition. So say a protein, has a very low amount of lysine, right? So that would be the limiting amino acid in that protein. But the animal actually needs more lysine, okay? So that's kind of just showing this depiction of, what is needed, right? So that means that you need another source, another protein source to get that amino acid requirement for that animal. And this can vary between species, right? So some animals need varying amounts of different amino acids, those essential amino acids, okay? So just as some examples of what some limiting amino acids are in different diets or different compounds, right? Different feeds. So if we're talking about cereals such as corn, rice, or wheat, the amino acid lysine is limiting, meaning it doesn't quite have enough lysine in there for the requirement. So we need another source of protein to give us that amino acid lysine. So same with methionine and cysteine, legumes, right? So beans, things like that. And milk products are limiting in methionine and cysteine. So again, you need another protein source to get the requirements. Same with tryptophan in collagen, and it's also second limiting in corn. So that means if you have corn, not only are you limiting in lysine, but also tryptophan. So you're going to need another source for tryptophan if you're having collagen, okay? So these are just some examples. Again, you don't need to memorize this. It's just to prove the point of the different, all proteins are not created equal, right? So you may have these limiting amino acids where you're not meeting that requirement for that essential amino acid, and you need something else in the diet to meet that demand. So what about the protein functions in the body? So we talked about some kind of general categories of proteins, different types of proteins, the amino acids that make up these proteins, but what are the functions? And the thing is there are many, many functions of proteins in the body. It's a very long list, but we can talk about and have talked about a couple of them. So structurally, so we said that they're found in a lot of connective tissues, in the muscle, so lots of structural components. Gene expression, okay, so how we turn on and off our genes in our body. We create proteins from DNA and genes, right? Enzyme catalyze, so they catalyze reactions, and enzymes are proteins. So enzymes are a big category of proteins, and they do a lot of different reactions in the body. They catalyze many different reactions in the body. Okay, so enzymes are a big one. Muscle contraction, so just the functioning of our muscles, right? Metabolic regulation, so metabolism and how we regulate our metabolism has to do with proteins. And immune function. So immune function, we talked a little bit about our globular proteins. So in the plasma, right? So immunoglobulins are very important in the immune system. We haven't even talked about, well, antibodies as well as hormones. So many, many different functions in the body, okay? So let's go through some of these functions in a little bit more detail. As we said that there are so many different functions in the body. So let's look at some of the tissue proteins. So these are proteins that are going to be found in our tissues, such as the structural components, the soft tissues, things like that. So a lot to do with collagen fibers. So those are those fibrous group of proteins. So we said that they produce collagen, keratin. So this is really the connective tissues, right? Those collagen fibers, as well as our skin, hair, and nails having to do with keratin, right? So lots of structural components there. Contractile proteins. So we said muscle contraction. So actin and myosin filaments in our muscle tissue are proteins. So that's how our muscles contract, okay? And if you remember back to maybe anatomy, physiology, and how how the actin and myosin shorten our muscle fibers. Blood proteins. So we've talked a bit about these guys as well, those globular proteins making up albumin, globulins, fibrinogen, hemoglobin. So lots of important proteins in the blood. Okay. So we said enzymes are a big category of proteins. So these are kind of our organic catalysts, and they're going to act locally to help with these different reactions in the body. So enzymes, we are continuously making and breaking down enzymes in our cells to help with these different reactions. And it actually takes a lot of energy for us to produce these enzymes, but the enzymes are what are going to speed up and help all of these reactions in the body. And it even takes 15 to 20% of our total energy expenditure, which is just a lot to think about, right? So that's almost a quarter of our energy expenditure being made or being put towards making and breaking down enzymes. So what do enzymes do, right? So they help decrease that the energy expenditure required for different reactions. So even though we're putting in a lot of energy to make these enzymes, the overall benefit of them in these different reactions is important. So they're going to bind with that substrate, which is whatever you're wanting to break down, right? And it helps the process and speeds up the process of breaking down those substrates, okay, into products. So another big category of proteins are hormones. So hormones, we have both protein hormones, or we call them peptide hormones, and lipid hormones or fat hormones. So we have both types of hormones in our body, but these protein hormones are produced in the cells and can affect a lot of different functions in the body, not just metabolism, okay? So what happens is these cells, these secreting cells, produce and secrete the hormones, and they're released into the bloodstream. And those hormones travel around the body and can affect different glands, different tissues in the different, just depending on what the job of that hormone is, it's going to have a different target tissue, target cell, target gland, and have an effect, right? So we talked a little bit about glucose metabolism in our body and how we regulate blood glucose, and that's done via two different hormones, right? So insulin and glucagon are these hormones that are going to affect glucose metabolism and glucose uptake, glycogen breakdown in the liver if we need more glucose. So that's just one example of how hormones can regulate and affect different functions in our body. So proteins also have a big immune response as well, or I should say immune responsibility. So we do produce what are called antibodies, and they are proteins that are produced by some of our white blood cells in response to a threat or an antigen. So this picture is fairly good, but not perfect. But we do have some white blood cells, some lymphocytes, specifically B cells, that are going around looking for specific antigens that are being produced by either viruses and bacteria, any sort of threat really, and they're looking for specific antigens. So once they find that antigen, say on a virus, they are going to be converted into what we call plasma cells, and those plasma cells are what are going to produce antibodies. So these antibodies are then secreted into the bloodstream, and they look for that antigen. So they look for that antigen on that virus, say, and they're able to bind to that antigen. And what they actually do is flag them for destruction, essentially. So then a different white blood cell comes and eats them, essentially. So it says it prevents them. It does kind of prevent them from attaching to receptors, but the big thing is it kind of flags them for destruction in the body. So that's what antibodies do. And that's a big component of vaccines, right? That's why we vaccinate, to essentially show our body that antigen and say, hey, build up an immune response, get those antibodies ready. When you see that antigen again, you're going to be able to fight it off much, much better. Okay, so big job of proteins in the form of antibodies and immune function. So we talked a bit about proteins and how they are folded peptides and chains of amino acids to build the protein. So folding is a very important component of protein metabolism and creating proteins. So what happens if we don't fold them correctly? Okay, so if we abnormally fold or misfold a protein, that's called a prion. And so prions are just misfolded proteins, and they can have detrimental effects as well. So they're actually these kind of infectious proteinaceous particles. And we find a lot of problems with prions, especially in the brain. So they can cause a lot of neurological diseases such as mad cow and dementia. So misfolded proteins are very bad, and specifically prions can be very detrimental. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of mad cow disease. And that's a normal slide of a brain on the left and a abnormal slide on the right. And then you can see the effect of Alzheimer's on the brain, which Alzheimer's is a form of dementia, but definitely some very big detrimental effects neurologically from these misfolded proteins. And I have a video there about mad cow, which is very interesting to watch if you haven't heard or don't know much about mad cow. So now let's talk a bit about protein metabolism. So how do we actually utilize these proteins? Basically, we really need to get them into their building block structure of amino acids. So we're constantly breaking down proteins into amino acids so that we can absorb those amino acids into our bloodstream. And then we can utilize them or synthesize them into proteins in the tissues. So we don't use the protein in its protein form, right, that we eat. We break it down, we get those building blocks, those amino acids, and then we make something else. We synthesize a protein that we need in the tissue. So we build a hormone, we build an enzyme, right? So we build what we need from those amino acids in the cells of our tissues. So there's two terms I want you to know regarding protein metabolism, and that's degradation. So that's turning protein into amino acids. So we're degrading them, we're breaking them down. And synthesis. So that's protein synthesis. So then we take those amino acids and we build proteins. Okay? So that is happening all the time, right? So we're constantly breaking down amino acids and building them into other proteins, okay? So you don't need to, memorize what's happening on the right-hand side there. It's just showing you how we can break down some protein found in our muscle, utilize those amino acids in our liver, and things like that, right? So with this turnover, this protein metabolism, we're going to create some waste as well. So that has to do with nitrogen, and we'll talk about nitrogen, ammonia, urea, things like that as well, because that's a constant production of waste as well while we're doing this process of degradation and synthesis. So here's just a little schematic of kind of what's going on in the body in terms of our amino acids and proteins. So we take those dietary amino acids that we've broken down from the proteins, and we have what are called free amino acids, right? And so then we're going to build body proteins, right, in the tissues, whatever we need. We can even break down those body tissues. We can degrade them back into free amino acids and go back and forth for whatever we need, right? So as long as we have those building blocks, we're able to create the proteins required for our body functions. But in this process, right, we're going to be creating nitrogen in the form of ammonia and urea, and that's that nitrogenous waste that we've been talking about. We're also going to be producing carbon dioxide, which is another waste as well. So with any sort of metabolism, you're always going to be producing waste. And that's why we have to excrete it, right, as urine and breathe it off as carbon dioxide. Okay, so those are two of our big wastes of our body metabolism. So to get these amino acids, we have to have sources of amino acids, right? So the biggest one we've talked about so far is dietary, right? It's definitely for those essential amino acids. They are required in the diet because we cannot produce them, right? We can't synthesize them in the body. But we can recycle a lot of our nitrogenous substances in the body, right? So we can break down some of these other substances. Some are proteins, some are not, and get those building blocks of amino acids. So we can break down enzymes, which they are proteins, right? Bile, we can break down bile, and even sloughed cells or dead cells. So lots of sources that we can utilize just within our body itself, okay? But obviously the dietary requirement is number one. Now, when we're talking about ruminants and hindgut fermenters, they can actually synthesize them via microorganisms. So the microbes that live inside their gut can actually synthesize quite a few amino acids. So they may not require as much protein, right, as many essential amino acids as other species. So again, these ruminants and fermenters are kind of a little bit different than a lot of other species because they are able to synthesize their own amino acids via those microbes. So the microbes are doing a lot for them, right? They're breaking down the cellulose for energy, and they're also synthesizing amino acids for them, which is just a great co-relationship with these ruminants and microorganisms. So once we have our amino acids, right, so we've gotten our amino acids from either dietary sources or breaking down things in our body, or we have microorganisms that have created them for us, we've absorbed them into our bloodstream, what happens now? So the biggest thing is tissue protein synthesis. So now this is going back to just transcription and translation, right, of our DNA. So our DNA is the blueprint, right, for building proteins. So essentially we read our DNA and we synthesize proteins using those amino acids, right? So we string together those amino acids, creating these polypeptides, which we then fold into proteins, okay? So that's the biggest thing, right? That's definitely our biggest use of amino acids. So then we can synthesize different types of proteins, right, as well, such as enzymes, hormones, metabolites, right? Not just structural proteins or blood proteins. So we can build a lot of different types of proteins. okay, that we've kind of gone through already. So there's just a little picture there on the right hand side of the difference between an enzyme and a hormone, which we've kind of gone through already, okay, but just for review. But the other big fate of amino acids is transamination and deamination. So we'll talk about that next, okay? So essentially building other amino acids and creating those nitrogenous wastes, okay? So let's talk about that. So transamination, okay, so think trans as kind of a change. So you're going to synthesize those non-essential amino acids from other amino acids, usually essential amino acids. So here's an example on the bottom, right? So you have, alanine, which is one of our amino acids, and you're going to undergo transamination with another compound. So essentially they're trading that oxygen for that NH2 group, and they're switching it. So you're creating pyruvate and glutamate, okay? So you're just kind of creating one essential amino acid from another. So that's transamination. You're kind of swapping the different groups on the compounds, okay? And of course, you don't need to get into the details of how it works, okay? Just know what transamination is. And then deamination, so think you're deaminating, so you're essentially you're creating waste, okay? You're removing the amino group, so it's no longer an amino acid, and then it gets it ready for the urea cycle. And so that has to do with nitrogen. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, okay? So deamination, you're removing that amino group. It's no longer an amino acid. You're getting it ready for the urea cycle. So this is important for that nitrogen cycle, okay? So let's take a step back and ask ourselves again, what about energy? So we've talked about all these different functions of proteins in the body, being really important and all these essential amino acids, but not once have we talked about energy, right? We've talked about metabolism and cell chemical reactions, cellular reactions and everything, hormones, but not once have we talked about energy. And that's because protein is not normally used for energy, okay? But it's used for all these metabolic purposes that we've talked about. So there's so many other functions that we require protein for in our body that we really don't use it for energy, okay? Which is very important to think about. But when energy intake decreases, so you're not meeting your energy demands via carbohydrates or lipids, more protein is used to meet those energy requirements. So then you're utilizing the protein in your body that should be used for something else as energy. Because again, if you look at our little cell cycle here, you can take that protein and those amino acids and turn it into acetyl-CoA, just like we can turn fatty acids into acetyl-CoA, pyruvic acid into acetyl-CoA, and turn that into the Krebs cycle, the TCA cycle, the cell cycle, right, to produce energy. We normally don't, okay? We don't like to, because we want to use those amino acids for all those other functions that we've already talked about. So keep that in mind, right? When we're talking about energy demands, energy requirements, protein requirements, it really does not have to do with energy for protein requirements, okay? So now let's talk a little bit about nitrogen and kind of nitrogen balance, nitrogen cycling. So we said that proteins and amino acids are our source of nitrogen for our body. So nitrogen is important for all living things. All living things need a source of nitrogen. So we're going to absorb the amino acids into the bloodstream, and we are going to recycle nitrogen back into the intestines. So in the intestines, we're having this nitrogen cycling, okay? So we want a nitrogen balance, meaning we take in nitrogen and we excrete nitrogen. So they should be equal, right? So the amount we take in, the amount we excrete should be equal, should be balanced, okay? And this determines the protein status as well, which is really important during growth. Okay, so protein is very important for growing animals, which I think a lot of us probably know that already inherently, but it has to do with the nitrogen requirement. So if we look at our little graph here and look at this kind of nitrogen balance, on the x-axis we have percent protein in the diet. So how much protein is actually in the diet versus nitrogen retained. So how much do we actually absorb and keep? So we don't excrete the nitrogen, we actually utilize the nitrogen. And if you notice, the young graph is a lot higher, meaning that they retain a lot more nitrogen, so they require a lot more nitrogen, aka protein, in their diet, right? Versus adults really kind of plateau, okay? They plateau at a lower amount. So it really should be 0 for adults, right? We take in, we excrete what we need, we don't retain all that nitrogen, okay? Or we excrete what we don't need, I should say, okay? So young, take-home message, require a lot more protein in their diet, okay, for that nitrogen source. So now let's look a little bit at the urea cycle. So we talked about the nitrogen cycle, a little bit more about nitrogen balance, nitrogen cycling, right? What we take in, we excrete. We need protein as a source of nitrogen. Now, we talked about protein degradation and protein synthesis as being a constant part of protein metabolism, right? We're constantly breaking down protein into amino acids. Now, when we do that, when we undergo protein degradation, we're creating waste products. And these waste products are ammonia and carbon dioxide. So ammonia, or NH4, right, is toxic. We kind of all know ammonia is toxic, right? As well as carbon dioxide. So what do we do with these waste products? Well, we put them into the urea cycle. So the urea cycle essentially turns those toxic substances, those waste products of ammonia and carbon dioxide, into urea so that we can excrete it from the body, okay? Now this happens in the liver. The urea cycle is happening in the liver, and then what happens is we excrete urea in our urine, okay? So you do not need to know the details of the urea cycle, right? Just know that we are able to get rid of these wastes from protein metabolism, protein degradation, in the form of urea, okay? So it's a way of detoxifying those wastes and getting them out of our body, okay? So now let's talk a bit about protein quality. So now that we know what protein metabolism entails, right? We're constantly breaking down proteins into amino acids, and then we're utilizing those amino acids to build other proteins. But this protein metabolism is very dependent upon the protein quality. So what do we mean by protein quality? It can be broken down into 2 different parts, digestibility and availability. So what does that mean? protein digestibility is how well that protein is able to be broken down and absorbed in the digestive tract. So how well is our body able to break down the protein into those amino acids, and then how well can we absorb those amino acids, okay? So like I said, not all protein is created equal, and this is why. Then availability depends on the amino acid content. So what types of amino acids are in that protein, right? And especially essential amino acids, and even more specifically, that limiting amino acid. So we said that maybe we have a limiting amino acid in that protein that doesn't meet the dietary requirement for that amino acid, right? Which creates it or makes it limiting, right? So as just kind of an example of the difference between digestibility and availability, I have a graph, a couple graphs down here. So it's comparing a couple different types of proteins. So the different colors are the different types of proteins. So in green we have whey protein, which is part of milk. We have milk, right, itself. We have casein, which is another milk protein. So both whey and casein are milk proteins. So they're found in milk, okay? And then we have soy. Soy is a protein source, and collagen, okay? So let's look at the three different tables. So the first graph or table graph is the digestibility of the different proteins. So if we notice that, and this is digestibility having to do with nitrogen, right? How much nitrogen are we actually absorbing? And whey protein has the best digestibility. It's almost 100%, right? Whereas milk, which even though whey is a protein of milk, milk itself is not very digestible, okay? Same with casein, right? So casein, another milk protein, is much more digestible than the milk product itself. And soy is up there as well, better than milk, okay? But then let's look at the essential amino acids in these different proteins, and we see that still whey protein is probably the best. So it's grams of essential amino acids per 100 grams of protein. So how much percent of the protein is essential amino acid protein, okay? So if you notice, you know, now we finally got collagen on there, is pretty low. So that means that the collagen is really not very digestible either. Okay, so it's not even on the digestibility chart. So it's not very digestible, has kind of a low amount of essential amino acids, okay, comparatively to the other protein sources. And then we can even look at one essential amino acid all by itself, which is leucine, right? And we said that sometimes there's a limiting amino acid in a protein source, okay? So again, it's just kind of showing you the differences between these different proteins, and maybe saying that if we are comparing, say whey protein versus soy protein, okay, whey protein would be a higher quality protein because it's more digestible and it has more availability, more essential amino acids, okay? So it's just a way to compare these different protein sources. So there's actually a way to do this, right? A little more maybe mathematically than just charts and graphs. How do they actually compare? And if you look at different proteins, they'll give you these different values, okay? And the biggest one, or kind of the most important one we talk about, is biological value, or BV. And that's the percent of nitrogen that is absorbed and can be utilized for growth and maintenance. So now we're really just talking about the nitrogen in the protein. okay? Because that's really what we're after when we're talking about nutrients and protein, and it's a source of nitrogen, okay? So there's an equation here for how we figure out the biological value. So it's saying that we have a nitrogen intake, right? And then we're going to excrete nitrogen as urea and in the feces as well. So you're going to combine those two, right? And then you kind of make it a percent, okay? So you're going to create a percent of what is utilized nitrogen, okay? And again, I'm not going to have you plug in any values into here. It's just to give you an idea of what biological value is, what it means, okay? And so we can kind of, this is how we compare these different proteins. So if we look at our little table here, we can look at whey protein as being probably the best in this protein source group, right? Because it has that BV value of 104, okay? Whole egg has 100, right? Beef 80, casein, that milk protein again, 77. So again, whey is better than casein, better than soy, right? But we also have rice and beans on there too. So lots of sources of protein, but in terms of protein quality, we can compare these. Now, whey protein, casein protein are milk proteins that you have to extract and get out of milk. You don't actually see it in nature, right, by itself. It's in milk. And we looked at that graph and we said before that milk actually is not very digestible. So it actually makes it not the best source of protein, okay? Maybe it has good availability in terms of its essential amino acids, but it's not very digestible. So if you look at the whole picture, eggs are actually considered the highest quality natural protein, right? So a little better than beef, but they're both up there, right? So again, this is just a way to assess protein quality, and we're really worrying more about that nitrogen availability for growth and maintenance. So when you talk about protein quality, right, we're saying that nothing is really perfect. You know, whey protein, egg protein, those are getting pretty high up there in terms of protein quality. But usually when you're talking about a single protein source, they tend to have a poor biological value alone. Because usually maybe they're not as digestible, or they have a limiting amino acid, so they don't have the higher availability. So that's usually why multiple protein sources together have a higher biological value, and why it is important usually to combine different protein sources so that you do get this higher biological value. Now, something that's really interesting out there is the use of insects as a great protein source. Okay, now, are they a sustainable protein source? Maybe, right? Maybe they're more sustainable than, say, livestock for milk and meat. They have a very high protein content. So look at the difference by weight of protein. So they are much higher than all of our meats, okay? Even more than steak, jerky, chicken. That is crazy to look at the difference, right? The protein by weight. But the problem is we don't know a whole lot about the protein quality of insects. We don't really know about their digestibility and their quality, okay? But this is where a lot of research is happening because they could be a very sustainable source of protein if we can figure out their protein quality. Okay, so I have a video for you guys on insects being used as protein sources, and it's quite interesting. Okay. So now let's talk about what's required. What are our protein requirements, and if we don't meet those, what happens with protein deficiency? So when we talk about protein requirements, that's actually a little bit of a misnomer because the requirements are actually based off of amino acids and not the proteins themselves. So it should be amino acid requirement instead of protein requirement, okay? So non-ruminants require those essential amino acids in their diet, and the different species could be different in their levels of requirements of those different amino acids, but essentially all those essential amino acids are required to some degree. Now, if we're talking about ruminants and hindgut fermenters, they can get all their amino acids from non-protein nitrogen. Okay, so they utilize those microbes in their intestines to produce urease. Okay, urease is an enzyme and it can break down urea. Okay, so we just said that we make urea to get rid of all those wastes. We get rid of ammonia and we get rid of carbon dioxide as urea, but they can actually utilize that urea. They take the urea, break it down, and they can actually get all those amino acids back from, or get them period, from the urea, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. So again, they don't actually have an essential amino acid requirement because they can get all their amino acids from the breakdown of urea. Now, obviously they're going to get some amount of protein in their diet, but they really don't require a specific amount of those essential amino acids in their diet, which is pretty impressive. So protein deficiencies are the most common nutrient deficiency. Okay, so think about that. Because it has to do with all those amino acids. Okay, we really need all those essential amino acids, and different proteins can be deficient in certain amino acids, and this can cause malnutrition or different disorders if those amino acid requirements are not met. Okay. So usually signs of protein deficiency are very similar to just basic malnutrition, right? So anorexia, right? Weight loss, decreased growth rate, negative nitrogen balance. So they're not getting enough nitrogen, right? Anemia, right? Their blood, red blood cells are low. That's what anemia means, okay? You're anemic. Fatty liver, right? So they're trying to utilize the fat in their body. They've utilized it all, creating this fatty liver, okay? So this is just kind of basic malnutrition. So you can have kind of general protein deficiency in the form of malnutrition, but also you can find specific amino acid deficiencies, and these can be species dependent because some species require different amounts of those essential amino acids. So I'm not going to have you guys memorize all these things, just kind of be familiar, especially with taurine. We'll talk about more detail. But arginine is a big one for cats. So deficient in arginine can cause hypersalivation, vomiting, seizures, and even death. Taurine is another big one. Dilated cardiomyopathy, retinal degeneration. Tryptophan is another one. methionine, leucine, phenylalanine. A lot of them have to do with dermatological problems, so skin problems. Many of them can cause death, GI problems, hair coat, feathering problems, because remember that a lot of it has to do with collagen, keratin, right? So a lot of it has to do with skin that we see kind of outwardly, right? So these are symptoms that we can see and appreciate superficially. It doesn't mean that there isn't anything going on inside, right? Especially that dilated cardiomyopathy. So let's go through a little bit, maybe what these look like, and we'll specifically go through taurine as well. So these are just some images of those different amino acid deficiencies. So arginine in a cat, right, that hypersalivation, so he's foaming at the mouth. Methionine causing, severe dermatitis. Leucine causing poor feathering in these chicks. So we can see lots of these problems for these specific amino acid deficiencies. So let's talk a little bit more about taurine deficiency, because this is something that's fairly relevant nowadays, specifically with dilated cardiomyopathy, so DCM. Now, it's well known, or at least since the 70s, that cats need taurine in their diet in a relatively high amount comparatively to other species. And so they associated dilated cardiomyopathy with deficiencies in taurine in these diets. But so that's kind of well recognized and taken care of for cats. But now they're seeing dilated cardiomyopathy in dogs, and they're relating the dilated cardiomyopathy to a dietary cause in dogs as well. So there's been some scary statistics recently in the last 2 years, I would say, with cases of dilated cardiomyopathy in dogs. And there's been a huge increase in these cases, and they seem to be related to the diet, and even more specifically related to these grain-free peas, lentils based diets. And so the FDA has actually undergone an investigation and is still undergoing investigations into why there's this association with dilated cardiomyopathy and these grain-free diets for dogs. And so it's still ongoing. But one thing they did look into was taurine as a possible cause, because it's so well known in cats that taurine deficiency can cause dilated cardiomyopathy. And taurine is not usually considered an essential amino acid in dogs because they're able to actually make it from 2 other amino acids. And so they looked into those levels of those other 2 amino acids, and they seem to be fairly normal. So they are investigating what the cause could be, but it's something really interesting to think about because there is this big association with the diet and these cases of dilated cardiomyopathy. They do have a specific breed that the majority of the cases have been seen in, and it's golden retrievers. But whether that means that maybe there's a genetic component to it that's new, or it's just the most common dog out there, I'm not sure. So if you're interested in this, I put the website for the FDA article and investigation on there, because it's just kind of interesting, and it's something that's popped up in the last few years and something to be aware of, not only for your own pets, but if you're talking to anybody else or recommending diets for anybody else, to kind of stay away for now from these grain-free, a lot of these kind of, natural kitchen, blue buffalo, in my opinion, is something to stay away from. All of those kind of tastes of the wild, natural diets, which is kind of scary because you think that they're maybe better for the animals, but maybe not, because they don't undergo as much testing as some of the big name brands. So anyways, that's kind of a soapbox for you guys, something to think about. But taurine was investigated. It wasn't necessarily ruled out, but they definitely thought of it because of the cat association with dilated cardiomyopathy. So interesting. All right, so we have come to the conclusion of our first unit for this class. So we have our first exam next week. There will be practice questions and a study guide posted on Canvas for you. The exam will be online in Canvas. It will be closed notes, solo test taking on your own, no group test taking. You can use a calculator, one with an exponential function, because you may be utilizing that for one of the short answer questions. I highly don't recommend using a phone because it doesn't usually have that exponential function. It will be timed, so once you open the exam, you'll have 90 minutes to complete it. It's just under 50 questions, or just under 60 questions, worth 60 points, because those couple short answer questions, they're worth a couple more points each. So I think it's about 56 or 57 questions. Mostly multiple choice, true, false, some matching questions with those couple short answer questions with calculations. So I do want you to do your work and kind of type it out the best you can in the answer field for those short answer questions. I kind of walk you through a little bit, what are the answers to this section and that section. So definitely, hopefully you can kind of utilize that and show your work a little bit. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll definitely answer questions during office hours. If you have any, we can go through some practice questions, anything you guys would like. So until then, talk to you guys later. Thanks.